In this video, we're going to find out what IPSec is and how we can use it to secure our network traffic. We're going to talk about the benefits that using security technologies like IPSec can provide us. We're going to also cover authentication methods, which is the process by which two computers can negotiate secure connections with each other. Now, there's different modes which we can use IPSec as well, transport mode and tunnel mode, and we're going to talk about those. And finally, we're going to talk about the connection security rules and the IPSec policies as well. So obviously there's a lot we need to cover in this video, so let's jump right in. So firstly, what is IPSec? Well, IP security, or IPSec as it's obviously better known, is a protocol that's designed to secure network communications by providing end-to-end encryption of your data using public key technology, or PKI. So what does that mean? End-to-end security. Well, it really means data that's traveling from one computer, we'll call this one the source computer, all the way over to another computer, which is going to be the destination. And the data that's traveling from our source computer over to our destination computer is obviously going to be encrypted. Excuse my small writing there. Now, it's not going to be decrypted and then re-encrypted along the way. This is a method of encrypting data straight at our source, and that data is going to remain encrypted until it finally reaches our destination. And that's why IPSec is so secure. Now, another great thing about IPSec is that IPSec is a standard. It's not just a Microsoft thing. So we can still implement IPSec even if we do have a mixed environment. Now, I will point out that obviously this is a video about IPSec on Windows 2008 servers, but it's important to realize that this isn't just a Microsoft or Windows thing. You know, there's a lot of different forms of security that we can use to protect our data. For example, we could use something like, let's say, EFS, the encrypting file system, to encrypt our data to make it unreadable by everyone by yourself. We could use NTFS permissions. We can police access to our files and folders using NTFS. And we've got other protocols like things like FTP and Telnet. These can all use basic password protections to govern access to confidential information. But what happens when all of these methods here are sent over the network? Well, using these technologies means that all of the files, even if they've been encrypted in the first place, they're then first decrypted and then sent to the destination. Now, that means that our files are being sent over the network in plain text. So there's a risk that our files and our passwords could be hijacked in transit and then openly read by the bad guys. Now, this is where IPSec comes into play, because IPSec enables us to encrypt and authenticate the data that's in transit. And the best part is it can add an extra layer of security to services that have little or no security. Now, IPSec operates at the network layer of the OSI model as an extension to the IP protocol. So whilst there's other protocols besides IPSec that provide encryption, things like SSL comes to mind, that's used to encrypt our web traffic. IPSec differs in that it can encrypt any traffic that uses IP datagrams regardless of what sort of information is contained within it. So a computer using IPSec is first going to encrypt the data. It's going to send it over the network, and that data is going to remain encrypted until it reaches its final destination. That means even when this IPSec packet crosses routers, this data is going to remain encrypted, as routers will only inspect the header information and not the payload or the data. And that's great. That's why we like IPSec, because it makes it so secure from an end-to-end perspective. Now, IPSec also offers us some other additional benefits. It offers the benefits of IP packet filtering. And because IPSec has its own independent packet filtering mechanism built in, it enables the prevention of these denial of service attacks by blocking traffic using any combination of ports or protocols or IP addresses. Now, IPSec also uses hash message authentication codes, or HMAC, to calculate a checksum for the data that's contained in each packet. Therefore, if anyone modifies the packet whilst it's in transit, then the HMAC in the packet is going to be different than what the receiving end will calculate it to be. Now, when two computers communicate over the network using these encrypted IP datagrams, both of them need to have access to shared key encryption. It's this key that enables one computer to encrypt the data and the other computer to decrypt the data. But this key, however, is not transmitted over the network connection. Instead, the two computers publicly exchange information about the calculations made that enabled them to arrive at the same key result. Now, before two computers can actually start using IPSec to communicate with each other and send data, the first thing they need to do is they'll need to authenticate with each other. So IPSec, under Windows 2008 and Windows 2003 for that matter, they can use three different types of authentication, not cansion. They could use Kerberos authentication, which is obviously popular in Active Directory environments. We could use digital certificates. Of course, that's going to require you to have a certification authority, or we could use a pre-shared key. Now, of these authentication methods, pre-shared keys are obviously very, very easy to use, but they are also the least secure, because what we're talking about here is really just a simple password that you'd type in on each computer that needs to communicate using IPSec. Still, in labs like mine, like the one I've got here that we're working in now, a pre-shared key makes it really quick for me to set it up without having to go and create a whole certificate authority hierarchy in order for me to just demonstrate IPSec in the lab. Now, once this trust has been created using one of these three authentication methods, and each party is authenticated with the other, the cryptographic checksum, or this HMAC here, in each packet is then used to digitally sign the packets to ensure that the data arrives without being tampered with. Which brings me to another point. We'll call this replay prevention. You know, even though IPSec encrypts data, it's still possible for a technically competent attacker to capture packets and use that data against you. When IPSec first communicates, the first few packets, the very first few, normally contain authentication information. So if an attacker was to capture and then retransmit these packets or replay them whilst they're still encrypted, attackers can use them to authenticate and gain access to the destination resources. So what IPSec does to prevent packet replays is that it assigns a sequence number to each packet. So if a packet's then received that has an incorrect sequence number, then IPSec is just going to drop it. Now, another important factor of IPSec is which mode it's going to operate in, because IPSec can operate in two different modes. It can operate in transport mode, and it can also operate in tunnel mode. Now, with transport mode, when two computers on a network communicate using IPSec, they'll use transport mode. And in the examples that we've talked about so far in this video, we've really been talking about this transport mode. So in this mode, transport mode, the computers authenticate with each other and use their shared encryption key to encrypt and decrypt the data. Now, if this data needs to cross routers, that's fine, because routers don't need to support the encryption. They just simply pass that packet on towards the destination. So obviously here we're really talking about PC or server to server communication. With tunnel mode, on the other hand, the source and the destination computers don't actually implement IPSec themselves, nor do they actually support the connection. Instead, with tunnel mode, we'll have our machine wanting to send some data, and there's our destination wanting to receive that data. It will be a router at each end of a WAN connection that's going to handle IPSec. So when computers transmit their data using this tunnel mode, they're going to use just normal, unprotected datagrams here, and these packets are going to hit that router, which is responsible for sending them out over the WAN, and this router is going to wrap those packets up nicely, encrypting them using IPSec. So router number one here is going to send out these encrypted packets to the router at the destination end, of the WAN connection, router 2 here. This router is going to verify those packets as normal. It's going to decrypt them as required, and then it's just going to repackage them up as normal packets and send them out to the destination on the private network. So in short, with our transport mode, encryption only occurs for the payload of the packet only. All that header information is not encrypted. And in tunnel mode, well, the whole packet is encrypted from router to router. Now, in case you're wondering, in the vast majority of cases, which one you're going to be using, that is going to be the transport mode. All right, now before we move on and actually start installing IPSec, let's quickly take a look at the components that make up IPSec on Windows Server 2008. So the first component we have is the IPSec policy agent. Now this is simply a Windows service that appears in your services list, and its job is to access the IPSec policy information that's stored in Active Directory or your Windows registry. Now next we have the Internet Key Exchange, and this Internet Key Exchange, or IKE if you like, is the protocol that IPSec computers use to exchange shared keys and to create a security association. Now this security association, by the way, has two different phases. Now the first phase is where the negotiation of which type of encryption and hash algorithms and authentication methods the systems are going to use, that's going to take place in phase 1. And in phase 2, this is where two single but opposite direction agreements are made. And this is where our two computers are going to agree to use IPSec and the encryption and hash algorithms the systems will use, as well as the authentication methods and the key generation. Now our final component of IPSec is the IPSec driver, which is what enables our secure network communication to take place. So this is going to include our HMAC checksums, the IPSec packet construction, and the encryption of the data itself. So this IPSec driver receives a filter list from the IPSec policy the system's using, and it's going to compare the outgoing packet to that list. Now, if the packet meets a criteria of the list, then IPSec drivers then kicks off this IKE communication process with that destination computer, and then it's going to add headers to the outgoing packet and encrypt the data inside. Now, on the other hand, if the packet's coming into our machine, if it's an incoming packet, then the IPSec driver's job is to calculate the hashes and checksums and compare those to what have arrived in the packet. Obviously, this is a lot to take in here, and before we dive in and we start configuring IPSec, one other thing I really should talk about is giving consideration to how you want IPSec to provide security in your organization. If you just drop IPSec in your network and attempt to use it to secure all network traffic, well, that might sound like a good idea right now, and you can certainly do that if you decide to, but it's not a particularly good idea, because IPSec, because of all of the additional headers and encryption and time it takes to calculate hashes, it's obviously a rather processor-intensive operation, and throwing it blindly into your network is definitely going to slow things down. So in Windows 2008, IPSec allows you to be pretty specific about what type of traffic you want to protect. Now, we could use our packet filters to filter on IP addresses, we could filter on ports, we could filter on protocols. And you can, and you should use these to ensure that IPSec only protects systems that match your filters. And that will let you use IPSec where it's really needed, and that'll obviously help with performance. So there's this balance of performance versus security to think about here with IPSec. And unfortunately, that's always been the case with security, and definitely something you want to consider here. Now also, you need to give some consideration to which operating system you're running in your environment, because only Windows 2000 and above support IPSec. So if you're running legacy Windows systems older than Windows 2000, then you're out of luck with those. But hey, Windows 2000 itself is pretty old now, and most of you should already kick those servers out of your network by now. But anyway, that's something else to consider. So with all of those thoughts out of the way, let's get stuck in and take a look at how we can configure Windows 2008 to use IPSec. So here we are logged onto our Windows 2008 domain controller, and unlike a lot of the other videos that we've done in the past whereby we'd need to install a role for some particular technology, with IPSec it's actually already installed but it isn't activated. Rather, it's something that we'll need to enable in group policy. So we're going to go and click the Start button. We'll fire up the Group Policy Management console. Now we're going to expand our forest, expand domains, expand our domain, and since IPSec isn't something that you're likely going to want to turn on for everything in your production network, and we did talk about this earlier, so what you'd really want to do here in production is to create a new group policy object just for IPSec and then attach it to a specific OU or something more granular than the entire domain. That way, IPSec is only hitting the servers that really need the extra security that it can provide. Now for my purposes here though, we're okay to use our default domain policy, but again, that's something that you really should give some thought to before you blindly start editing this policy. Like I said though, for my lab it's okay, so I'm going to right click on our default domain policy and choose Edit. Okay, now what we're going to do is under the computer configuration heading, we are going to expand policies. We'll then expand Windows settings. And we'll expand security settings. And down the bottom, we've got these IP security policies on Active Directory. Now do understand, by the way, that it does say IP security policies on Active Directory. We're talking about setting this up for members of our domain right here. Now conversely, if we wanted to set up local IPSec policies for this machine only, we could do that by clicking Start, going to Administrative Tools, choosing the local security policy. And down the bottom here, we'll have the ability to create IPSec policies on the local machine. Now do note that if we do select this over here on the right hand side of the console, you'll see that we aren't given any default policies to work with. Now that's okay though, because what we'll be doing shortly is creating our own, except we'll be doing this within Active Directory, not just on this local machine. Alright, so that's how you do it for the local machine. Let's close this policy window here. And we're going to go back to our Group Policy Management console. So we're going to click this link here, IP Security Policies on Active Directory. And this time in the right hand side, you can see we do have 3 policies already defined which we can use to configure IPSec. Now next to each policy you can see a description of what it does and the status of the policy. And at this time obviously none of these policies are currently assigned, or in simple terms it means that all of these default 3 policies are not working and they're not applying to any machine in our domain. So here's the easy part, turning IPSec on. We could simply right click on any of these policies and choose to assign the policy. Now that's pretty simple, but obviously we're not going to do that just yet because IPSec requires a little more thought before we jump straight in with both feet. So let's take a look at what these 3 policies do. So the first policy we have is a client policy, respond only. Now when we apply this policy to a client computer, then that computer will never ever initiate an IPSec conversation. They won't be able to start a conversation with IPSec, but they can respond to requests to use IPSec. So, for example, let's say a server is using this policy to request security. Well, that means that a server will request that any computer it talks to uses IPSec. So if that server says, hey client, I want to use IPSec, then with this policy, the client can respond to that request and use IPSec. But it's not going to happen the other way around though. The client won't ask the server to use IPSec. Now this is quite a useful policy because a client will use IPSec when it's asked to. But for other systems that don't use IPSec or don't support IPSec, the client will then still be able to communicate with them quite happily. Now the next policy we have is secure server require security. And as the name implies, to be able to talk to a server that's been configured with this policy, the client must be able to use IPSec. Maybe isn't an option here. If the client doesn't support IPSec, then the server is going to terminate the connection, and that's it. So the key word here is require. It's going to require IPSec or there's no connection. Now with that in mind, it's really quite important that you give careful consideration to your environment before you start using this policy. Because if you've got legacy systems in your environment that can't use IPSec, then those machines simply won't ever be able to talk to these servers. So in that situation, you'd either have to upgrade the client to a newer operating system that does support IPSec, or downgrade the server's IPSec policy to the next one to request security instead of requiring it as they would do with the second policy. And speaking of requesting security, the final policy obviously is where the server requests security. So this means that when a client computer contacts a server that's applying this policy, the server will request that the client uses IPSec to secure their conversation. Now, if that client does support IPSec, then the negotiation phase begins and IPSec will be used. But if the client is an old legacy client that doesn't support IPSec, then the server will still talk to it using standard methods without the security of IPSec. Now, these IPSec policies consist of three key elements. They consist of rules, filter lists, and filter actions. So if we double click on one of these policies here, let's just use the middle one here, we'll be able to see the rule that's associated with this policy. Now, a rule is a combination of an IP filter list and a filter action, which together specify when and how this server should use IPSec. So for this policy that we're looking at right now, secure server require security, there's three defined rules. We've got all IP traffic, all ICMP traffic, and the default rule. Now with these rules, they're actually listed by default in reverse alphabetical order, but they're not necessarily applied in that order. The IPSec driver, it applies rules in the order of most specific to least specific. So for example, if we had a rule in this list that contained a specific IP address and another rule that covered any IP address, the rule that contains a specific IP address would be processed first, as the rule is obviously more specific in what it's targeting. So a rule is the first element of an IPSec policy, and the next element is the filtered list here. Now in this window, we're using several filters. For example, with our first rule we're looking at with all IP traffic, if we double click on this, we'll see the filter list for this policy. So filter lists are basically a collection of filters that specify the traffic that the policy should secure based on something like the IP address, the protocol, or the port. So we're not limited to these two, by the way. We can create our own, and we're going to do that in a moment. Now on our filter action tab here, we can also specify how IPSec should provide security for our filtered packets. So our options here are to permit the traffic, which is basically providing no security at all. We can choose to request security and try and use IPSec, but if our client doesn't support it, then we're going to allow the connection to take place anyway. And the bottom option here is to require security. Obviously this option means that we must use IPSec or simply drop the connection. Now, even though Microsoft provides these three default policies, and yes, you can certainly use them if you like, I'd recommend that you create your own. So let's suppose that we've got a user called Jordan, and part of Jordan's duties are to update this server with some confidential documents. Now, due to the confidential nature of the documents, we don't want Mr. Hacker McNasty eavesdropping on the line and getting a copy of those files. Obviously, we need to secure the traffic that's coming from Jordan's PC to this server. And don't forget, we'll need to do the reverse as well and secure the traffic that's coming from this server to Jordan's computer. So let's do what we do best. Let's earn our money and set it all up. So firstly, we're going to come over here to the left-hand side. We're going to right-click on IP security policies for Active Directory, and we're going to create an IP security policy. Now this starts up the new policy wizard. Let's click Next. All right, well, we'll need to give our policy a name and also an optional description. Now, since we're talking about setting up a secure connection with Jordan's PC and our server here, why don't we call it something like IPSec with Jordan's PC. For the description, well, you can enter in what you like. Obviously, try and make it describe at least what this policy does. That way people understand later on why this policy exists. So I've just put in here that this policy is to secure the communication between Jordan's PC and this server DC01. Now this is required so Jordan can transmit confidential documents securely. Well, there you go. That's nice and descriptive. All right, well, let's click Next. Now here we can configure this policy to use a default response rule. And as it says here at the top, we'd use this rule to respond to remote computers that request security when no other rule applies. However, you'll note that this rule isn't applicable to Windows Vista or Windows 7 machines, only to versions of Windows earlier than that. So in my case, I don't need to activate this rule because I'm using Windows 7 machines in my lab. Now what this rule does, though, is it makes the remote computer have to respond to requests to use IPSec. Because if the active policy doesn't have a rule defined for a computer that's requesting to use IPSec, this default rule will then be used and IPSec will also be used if possible. So I'd probably turn this on if I had old machines, but like I said, for Windows Vista and higher, which is all I have in my lab, we won't bother because this rule actually doesn't apply. In fact, I'm actually going to say yes here and I'm going to activate this feature just so I can show you the next step in the wizard, because the next page won't appear unless we do select this checkbox. So it's okay anyway, because we could turn off this default response in a moment and I'll show you how to do that. So I will check this box, even though it's not really going to do anything for my lab, and we'll click Next. All right, now this screen here won't appear if you didn't check the previous box. In fact, if you didn't check the previous box, then this would actually be the end of the wizard right now. So since we checked the box, we're asked to choose which authentication method to use with our default response rule. And we've already talked about these earlier in this video. We could use Kerberos version 5. We could use a certificate from a certification authority, which means obviously we will need to have a CA somewhere in our network. Or we could use a pre-shared key, which is simply just a password, something that we'll just enter in this box here. Then we'd need to do the same on any other machines that use this policy, and away we go. Well, I'm going to go with the default of Kerberos, and we'll click Next. Okay, well, that was the only difference in that wizard, so here we are at the end. So that's the first part of the wizard done, and we're going to leave this checkbox checked, and once we click Finish, it's going to create the policy and open it up automatically and allow us to edit the properties, and we definitely do want to do that. So we'll leave the box, we'll click Finish. And in our Properties window here, you'll note we've got two tabs. We've seen this before anyway when we looked at the earlier rules a moment ago. So right now, all we have is this default or dynamic filter, which you might note is enabled as we selected the default response rule a moment ago, and that's what it did, enabled this rule. So to turn it off, we'd simply uncheck this box. Okay, so let's now add a rule to this policy, because right now, especially since I just unchecked that box, we don't have any rules applying with this policy. So down the bottom, we're going to click the Add button. That's going to start up a new wizard, the Create IP Security Rule wizard, which we'll use to decide under which conditions IPSec will be invoked. For example, if we match a particular source or destination address or a certain type of IP traffic. So let's get started by clicking Next. And right off the bat, we'll need to choose between using transport mode and tunnel mode. Remembering, transport mode is where we have two machines directly connecting with each other and both of them using IPSec. And the second one, tunnel mode, is where we'd have two routers using IPSec and passing traffic, encrypted traffic, between two networks. Now this defaults to not specifying a tunnel, or in other words, this defaults to transport mode, the mode that you're most likely to use anyway. Now, if you do decide that you want to use tunnel mode, then you'll select the second radio button here, and you'll need to enter in the IP address of the destination machine, the machine that you want to connect to, and they'll need to do the same on the other side. Pretty simple. All right, well, obviously, we are going to go with the default, of course, to not specify a tunnel, and that means we're going to use transport mode. That's what we'll select. and we'll click Next. Now, what network type will this rule support? Will it support all network connections, or only within our local area network, or only remote machines? Now, obviously, whatever you pick here is going to match your target machines. For my lab, I'm just going to leave it at all network connections and click Next. And now we'll need to choose which filter to apply with our policy, and we've got a couple of choices here. We could go with all ICMP traffic or all IP traffic. So we'd either choose to match all ICMP packets between this computer and another computer, or all IP traffic between this computer and another computer. Now, something else I should mention is just because something's listed here, for example ICMP, it doesn't explicitly mean that we'd be securing that traffic using IPSec. Now, we could use this filter list to allow that traffic to be passed through without using IPSec if we wanted to. Actually, that's probably the best example I could give you, because ICMP is typically used for troubleshooting purposes, and generally that's something that you don't want to use with IPSec. Now, the reason why that is if we're trying to troubleshoot a problem with IPSec and our troubleshooting tools are being encrypted with IPSec, it can make it hard to troubleshoot, and potentially, if IPSec is really screwed up, it can make it so that we can't even use those troubleshooting tools at all. So by not encrypting ICMP traffic, we're still allowed to use those tools in that extreme example. Now, you might have noticed that neither of these two radio buttons here is actually checked by default. Well, we do actually need to select something here, because if we try and continue without selecting anything, we'll be told that we need to select a valid IP filter list. Now, that also means that we don't have to select either of these two here. We could click Add and just make up our own. So let's do that. Let's click Add. Firstly, we'll give this a name. I'll say we can encrypt all data from Jordan to DC01, which of course is this server. We can fill in an optional description if we like. Now, note that under here we've got this checkbox to use the Add Wizard. Now, if we uncheck this box and then click the Add button, it's just going to pop up this window with these three tabs here, and we can enter in all the fields that way. Or, if we just cancel this and check that box again, and now click Add, this time a wizard pops up, as you probably expected that it would. So let's use the wizard this time, but the option is there for you guys to choose whichever of those methods you'd rather use. So let's click Next. Again, we'll start with a description if we like, which is optional of course. Now this checkbox down the bottom here, take note of it. Mirrored. Match packets with the exact opposite source and destination addresses. Now what this does is it sets up the exact opposite connection. Now this is useful since in earlier versions of Windows we'd manually have to set up both sides of the connection. So we've set up one from my machine to yours and one from your machine to mine. Now this checkbox simply sets up the opposite side of the connection automatically, which saves you time. So in most cases we'll want to leave this box checked, as we will now, and we'll click Next. Now for the source of the traffic, it's going to be from this server, so I'm going to choose my IP address. We'll click Next. Now the destination won't be left at any address, it'll be using a specific IP address, or we could also use a specific host name as well. Either of those will work. Let's go with the IP address here, and the IP address will be 10.32.0.120. We'll click Next. Now for the protocol, we can select one from this list or accept the default of any. In fact, I'm not going to go with any, as that's a little drastic. Let's go with something else for the purposes of this exercise. Let's use ICMP as an example. I'm going to select that. We'll click Next, and then we'll click Finish. All right, well, there's our IP filter, which right now is designed to encrypt any ICMP traffic from Jordan's machine to this server and vice versa. But any other machine that connects to this server, of course, will not be using IPSec. This is just a single rule that only affects traffic from Jordan to here. All right, well, let's click OK now, and let's select our IP filter from the list. Now we'll click Next, and then we'll be asked to define what action we want to take when traffic is going between these machines. Do we just want to permit the traffic and not use IPSec? Well, no, not in this case, but we could use this feature to exempt certain computers or protocols from being encrypted. Useful for troubleshooting, like I said a moment ago. Now we could make IPSec optional by choosing to request security, or make it mandatory by choosing to require it. So let's make it mandatory. Let's say we will require security, and we will click Next. All right, now we'll need to choose what authentication method we want to use, and we've already talked about these earlier in this video. We could use Kerberos version 5, a certificate from a certification authority, or a pre-shared key password. I'm going to go with Kerberos for now. We'll click Next, and we're done. We'll click Finish. All right, well, there's our rule. So let's click OK. And now we have our new policy. Now, to put this policy in place, we will need to assign it. And take note here of our policy assigned column. We currently still don't have any policies assigned yet. Now, although I just did say policies, the truth is, though, you can only have one policy assigned at any time. So if we right-click on the client policy and choose Assign, you'll note here that it's obviously changed to be listed as assigned. Now let's right-click on our new policy and let's choose to assign that one. What it's going to do is automatically unassign the current policy and then assign this one. So obviously that's a quick demonstration of the fact that you can only have one policy in effect at any time. So that's basically it really. IPSec between these two computers is now live, and there's really nothing more to do. Now obviously in a production environment you're likely to have more than two computers participating in IPSec, so it's highly probable that you'll set up a specific OU and put members that participate in IPSec inside that OU. But the fact is, IPSec is live, it is running, it's actively securing and encrypting our communication between these two machines. Now, if for some reason you decide that you do want to turn this policy off, you can easily do that by again right-clicking on it and choosing to unassign it. Now, once we do that, the policy will be obviously unassigned. Now, one final thing I want to talk about with regards to our policy is the filter action. So let's double click on our policy again and let's choose our IP filter list here. We're going to click Edit, or we can double click it, does the same thing. We're going to go to the filter action tab. Let's select our action here, require security, and let's choose Edit. Now this is going to bring up a new window, one we haven't seen yet. And from here, we're able to get down further into the various settings for our filter actions. Now, by the way, we could have done this when we created our policy and we went through the wizards. I just chose to skip through those options then, mainly because 99% of you listening probably won't come in here and configure this stuff anyway. But for those of you that do want to poke around in here, at the top you can see we've got three options. We can permit traffic, which is not really what we want to do because this offers no security. This is basically the same as saying don't require IPSec. We can block traffic, which is self-explanatory, or we can negotiate security using IPSec. Well, in our case, we do want to use IPSec, so we're going to leave the default at negotiate security. Now, in the middle of this window, we're able to choose the security method preference order, or in which order would we like to use these different security methods. So if the first one doesn't work, we're going to try the second one. Now, if that doesn't work, we're going to try the third one, and so on. So by default, we're going to be using the triple DES with SHA-1, down to the less secure regular DES with MD5. Now, by the way, triple DES is only supported on Windows XP and above, so if you are using Windows 2000, then regular DES is your only option. Now, the main other difference between the two DESs is that standard DES, the data is encrypted using 56-bit encryption. With triple DES, that data is encrypted, decrypted, and then encrypted again, each time using a different 56-bit key. So as you can imagine, it is processor intensive, but it does provide excellent security. Another point is that SHA-1 is also 160-bit, whereas MD5 is 128 bits. Okay, so how do we want to handle communication with Jordan's PC if it doesn't support IPSec? Well, the default here is to accept the unsecured communication from his machine, but always respond using IPSec. or we could choose to fall back to a standard unsecured connection. Well, in our case, that's what Jordan is already doing, and in a worst case scenario, this option will still allow Jordan to talk to this server, albeit without the security. Now finally, we can use Session Key Perfect Forward Secrecy, or PFS. Now whilst that's a mouthful to say, this is a good option to enable because what it means is when session keys are swapped out, the new session key won't simply be shipped across the existing secure connection. Now that would enable an attacker who's recorded all communications between two machines to break one session key and therefore immediately unravel all the rest of the session keys exchanged over time. With this PFS enabled, the new session keys exchanged using a protocol called the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So what it means is that an attacker would need to break each session key individually, making it a much tougher nut to crack. Now there is one final piece to this IPSec puzzle, and it relates to our Windows firewall. Now for those of you that have seen our videos on the Windows firewall, you'd know that there's an option in there that allows you to configure secure connections. And it's those secure connections that in a way relate to what we're doing here with IPSec. So whereby with IPSec, we're setting up an IP security configuration rule from one computer to another, or one subnet to another, or a variety of different source and destination protocols and so forth. With our connection security rules in our firewall, we'll be doing a similar thing, except we'll be applying them based on what sort of network profile we're using, whether we're connected using a public network or a private network or a domain. So although this is something we've discussed in our Windows firewall videos already, let's go and take a quick look. So in our group policy management console, we'll come up to and expand Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. We'll then expand Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, and we're going to choose Connection Security Rules. Now there aren't any default ones, as you can see, so we're going to right click and we're going to create a new rule. Now that'll start up the new rule wizard where we've got 5 types we can choose from. We have isolation rules, authentication exemption, server to server, tunnel, and custom. So the first type of connection security rule is an isolation rule, which we can use to restrict connections based on authentication criteria, such as whether computers are a member of our domain, whether they meet the health validation requirements, which basically means are they applying the correct software updates. Now we could use authentication exemption, which means don't worry about authenticating with the other computer or a range of computers, and it's useful for things like domain controllers or DHCP servers, so we could exclude those guys from having to use IPSec and deal with that extra overhead of the authentication process. Now we've also got server-to-server authentication, and we can use this one to authenticate between two computers. And don't pay much attention to the fact that it says server-to-server. It's simply used when you want two computers to authenticate, or two groups of computers, or two subnets. Now next we have tunnel, and this is used when we have two computers that want to communicate over a tunnel such as a VPN or an IPSec tunnel. And finally at the bottom we can create our own custom connection security rule. So let's run through one of these real quick so you get the idea of how this differs from our IPSec policy that we've just been looking at. Now I'm going to choose the custom one at the bottom here. We'll click next. And the first step is to define both endpoint computers. So here we'll be able to specify which computers are going to be talking to which computers. Now the default you can see is for any computer at any IP address to be talking to any IP address. But you can change that to talk to a specific IP address if you like by selecting these IP addresses and then click the Add button. And from this window here you can either enter in a single IP address, a range of IP addresses, or we could choose from a predefined set of computers from this drop-down list, including things like Wins, DHCP, DNS, the default gateway, or computers from our local subnet. Now, if you further want to restrict this rule to only using a specific interface, you can also choose the Customize button here, and then choose from the local interface, any remote access interfaces, and wireless ones that you might have in your computer. Alright, well, I'm just going to set this to any IP address. Let's click Next. And here we'll need to define what sort of authentication needs to occur between these computers, if any, for communication to take place. Now at the top, we can request authentication, but if it's not available, such as the remote computer doesn't support it, then we're just going to connect without authenticating. Now we can also choose to require authentication for any connections coming into our machine, but only request it when we make outbound connections. We could choose to require authentication for both inbound and outbound connections, which is obviously the most secure option. And finally, we can choose not to have any authentication at all. Now I'm going to leave the default here to request authentication, and we'll click next, and here we'll be able to set what sort of authentication that we want to use. So up the top we can see that the default is to use the default. Well, that's great, the default authentication method. Well, that's rather helpful if you don't know what the defaults are. Now these defaults are found in the profile properties of your firewall, and in a moment I'm going to show you where they're found. Now the remaining choices that we've got here are for restricting communications to only authenticated users and authenticated computers, authenticated computers only as long as they belong to our domain, and using a certificate. Now down the bottom we've got the advanced options, so if we check this button and click the customize button, we're then able to create custom first and second authentication methods. Now the difference between this first authentication method and the second authentication method is that the first over here on the left hand side is concerned with the initial negotiations for the computer to authenticate. And over here on the second side, this is when the user logged onto the computer needs to authenticate. So from this window, we could choose which method we want to use for each phase of the authentication and even make them optional. So for argument's sake, in the first authentication method on the left-hand side, let's choose the Add button. And we can choose from Kerberos authentication, NTLM version 2, a certificate, or a pre-shared key, which obviously, as it says, isn't recommended because the key is stored in plain text. So I'm going to choose Kerberos here. We'll click OK. Now we can click Add again. Let's add in NTLM. We'll click OK on that one as well. Now what we've just configured is that for our first authentication attempt, we're going to try and use Kerberos. Now if that fails, we're going to move on and attempt to use the next method in the list, and so on and so forth until all of these are tried. Now at this point, if none of them work, the connection itself is going to fail unless we check this box at the bottom, which of course simply says that any of these authentication methods are now optional. Now over on the right hand side, on the second authentication side, the process is exactly the same. However, here we're concerned with user authentication. So we'd click Add, and again we've got the same authentication methods, except these ones pertain to users and not computers. Now once you've made your selections, simply click OK and you're ready to go. But do be aware that if you chose to click on this radio button here, this checkbox here, that the second authentication method is optional, and we've already configured the first one to be optional, then basically what we've just done is turned authentication off. Because if all of these authentication methods fail and all of the second ones fail, both connections are going to proceed anyway, without any regard to whatever authentication methods you've put in these boxes here. Now, down the bottom here at this window, you can see we've got this link here. What are the default values? So let's select that. And in here, you'll be able to see all of the values that'll be used when we leave the default settings checked. So I did say I'd show you where you could find these default settings. Well, they're all listed right here. All right, well, let's close this now. You can read these at your own leisure if you're interested. Let's go back to our rule. Now I'm just going to click cancel here and leave this at the defaults, and we'll click next. And right here, here's our real difference between our IPSec rules and our connection security rule. This connection security rule is going to apply when we're connected to a domain, when we're connected to a private network, or connected to a public network. Now obviously we can apply this to any or all of these profiles if we liked, and all of them are checked by default, and that's fine. I'm going to leave these defaults. So we'll click next. We'll need to give our new connection security rule a name. I'll just call this test, an optional description as well, and then let's click finish. Okay, so in this video we've talked about IPSec or IP security, which is a really good way that we can secure our network communications between two machines or two networks. Now obviously there's quite a bit of planning that should be involved before you simply drop IPSec in, and it's a good idea to not simply link these IPSec policies to your default domain policy, rather create a new one and link it to the appropriate targets. Now with IPSec, there's not just only the security itself you need to consider, but using IPSec will decrease performance because there is an overhead associated with using it, so you want to factor in performance issues as well. So give IPSec a go for those systems that require higher security, because it really will help make things a lot more secure. Now we hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'd like to thank you for watching.